Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for coming. It's great to see all the faces out there to listen to this talk. My name is Diane Dubinsky, and I'm a professor in the Ecology, Evolution, and Organismal Biology Department, EEOB, and I'm a member of this team of faculty members putting together an NSF proposal for what's called institutional transformation. And as part of this proposal writing, we actually haven't written our proposal yet. We're going to have focus groups, and we're bringing in speakers to talk about issues about equity and diversity. So we've already had Denise Denton come a few weeks ago, who was a dean of engineering at University of Washington, and today we're going to hear from Joan Williams. And the purpose of this advanced grant is to increase the participation and advancement of women in science, technology, engineering, and mathematical fields. So Professor Joan Williams is here today to talk to us, and she is a professor and also the director of the program on gender, work, and family at the American University Law School. She's written a book called Unbending Gender, which you saw out there in the hallway, Why Family and Work Conflict and What to Do About It. It's a great book. I'd highly recommend you picking up a copy. You might even be able to get a signed copy afterwards. She's also a regular contributor to a column which I used to read, especially 2 years ago, in the Chronicle of Higher Education called The Balancing Act, which is, I don't know if any of you have read that, but it's a really neat column about balancing work and family obligations in the university setting. She's going to outline a new vision for the workplace focused on the needs of families, and she proposes what I think are a very practical set of policies and legal initiatives to reorganize the two realms of the working employment and the households, which will enable both men, women, and children, men and women as well as children, to lead what I think would be healthier and more sane lives. Today's lecture is supported by quite a few different groups on campus, and we're really there's been quite a bit of generous donations. We want to thank the Office of the President, the Office of the Provost, the Office of the Vice Provost for Research and Advanced Studies, the College of Agriculture, College of Engineering, College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, Shared Leadership for Institutional Change Program, Women's Studies, the ISIS Grant Program, and also the Committee on Lectures. We want to thank them for helping to organize this event. So today we will hear from Joan, and the title is Why Family and Work Conflict and What We Can Do About It. And I hope her message will resonate with you as well as it did with me. Thanks.
Thank you for that generous introduction. Let me say how delighted I am to be here. I now realize that Iowa always has weather this beautiful, and I'll come back very often. It's also really inspiring for me to be at the first land-grant university. I've always taught at a private university. I've always been very deeply committed to public education, and it's really inspiring to see a public university that has been, carrying out the public trust for over 100 years. So I'm really delighted to be here. And on a lighter note, it's so great to be in Iowa because not everybody wears black. I am so tired, but I won't go there. My subject is actually work and family today, and I want to start out by defining the problem, then talk a little bit about solutions, and end up with a few words about the politics of the issue, because of course that's crucial in terms of trying to make the solutions come into effect. The problem, people usually think, the problem of work and family is really a problem of personal priorities or personal choice, or of juggling things that you obviously need to do, or often of women's choice to quit as an expression of their own priorities. But in fact, I think the problem of work-family conflict really reflects a clash of two social ideals. And the first we hardly ever think about, but if you think about the way we define the ideal worker, it's as someone who starts to work in early adulthood and works full-time, full force for 40 years straight. And in the United States, if you think concretely about what that means, we actually in the United States work more overtime than any other industrialized country. We work more hours. And that actually includes Japan, the people with a word for death from overwork. We work more than they do. So if you think concretely about what that means to be an ideal worker in good jobs, you're going to be leaving home, say, at 8 o'clock in the morning, and then you'll be coming home at 6, 7, even 8 o'clock at night, which means that an ideal worker will have very little time with children, and if you have a baby, an ideal worker, you may never see the baby awake. And the problem with defining the ideal worker in that way is that it just doesn't fit with our ideals of family life. Because we have another ideal, I call it the norm of parental care. And it's really very simple. It's the idea that children need and deserve time with their parents. And this is really a very widespread and uncontroversial sense of what children need. And the norm of parental care is really broader also than children, because there are other situations in which we feel that you need family-delivered care. For example, most of us would consider it just shabby to leave a partner or a parent to die alone or in a final illness. So the problem of work and family really represents not a personal problem of juggling, but a social problem where we're caught between the clash of these two ideals. And that the system that is built on that clash really creates a situation that's bad for men, it's worse for women, and it's worst by far for children. First of all, it's bad for men. Faced with this clash of these two ideals, men tend to make trade-offs on the family side. Typically, they live up to the ideal worker norm, and in doing so, they pay a substantial price. 1 out of 3 American fathers works 50 or more hours a week, and there is increasing apprehension on the part of many fathers about how that attenuates their involvement in family life. And I actually think here of an op-ed. This is, again, one of these, everybody in black cities from the New York Times. And there was a high-powered man who was, an investment banker or whatever. And he was saying that he wanted to show his wife that he could do it all just the way she could do it all. And so he decided to get a group of guys together and take the babies out to a power lunch. Well, their first thought was to go to the Four Seasons, which is a really fancy restaurant. That they eventually ended up at California Pizza Kitchen with their babies. And he says, totally without self-consciousness, our wives or nannies brought the babies into Manhattan, and then we went out for lunch, and then they came back into Manhattan and brought the babies home. This is one interpretation. This is one interpretation of a new vision of fatherhood, and I suspect that it's, but it is tapping into this cultural trend where men are increasingly being caught in this clash of ideals too, because the sense is that being a good father entails active involvement with children's lives. And in fact, if you look at the studies, up to half of fathers say they would gladly trade off big chunks of their salary, up to 25%, for more family or personal time. On the other hand, fathers feel under incredible gender pressures to be good providers, and increasingly so in this day and age. And what you have is actually a sharp class differential that emerges between privileged fathers who are under extreme pressure to work very long hours and whose hours are increasing, and less privileged fathers who cannot be providers and can't get enough hours. And so there's what's called the time divide, which is partly a time divide among men based on class position. So this is a system that takes a big toll out of men. It's also a system that takes a very big toll out of women in ways that we typically don't really admit. Faced with this trade-off between these two social ideals, women tend to make trade-offs on the work side. And if you look at not men and women, but at mothers and others, you see very, very dramatic patterns demographically. What we really have is not a system of gender equality, which is what we like to think, but what I call the economy of mothers and others. It's true, certainly, that most mothers work, taking that to mean paid work, and avoiding the fact that family work is also work. Most mothers are employed, about 70%, but if you look at their employment patterns, they're very different from the employment patterns of non-mothers. And here I'm going to look at mothers aged 25 to 44, which is really the key years of career advancement. 2 out of 3 of those mothers work less than a 40-hour week. 2 out of 3. 1 out of 4 is out of labor force. Those are the homemakers. And in many ways, the most dramatic figure is that 95% of those mothers work less than 50 hours a week. So that means any employer who defines full-time to require lots of overtime has come close to wiping mothers out of the labor pool. And that's a very sobering picture, I know, for young women coming up who are trying to figure out how to fit work and family together in an environment when most good jobs require full-time to mean what is traditionally in the United States meant overtime. These figures help us understand what's typically been called the glass ceiling, why women have not made it into the top positions. They haven't made it in the 87% of law firm partners are still men, 95% of upper management is still men. The overwhelming number, 75% of tenured professors are still men. Women face a severe glass ceiling. But what this analysis shows you is that many women don't even get near that glass ceiling because they're stopped long before by what I call the maternal wall. And what happens when women are stopped in that way is because in the United States, we have sort of a particular situation where work status is virtually the only source of social status and responsibility and authority. You have a real sharp differentiation between mothers and others, and that too is part of the economy of mothers and others. Before I talk about the impact on children, I want to talk first of all about non-parents, because part of the instinct of people who are focused on women is not just to focus on mothers, and that's a very important instinct. Because after all, women are under incredible gender pressure to become mothers, and we need to recognize that women should be able to be full adults without becoming mothers. So what are the implications of all of these trends for non-parents? In the economy of mothers and others, non-mothers also pay a very concrete economic price, because in many workplaces, all women are presumptive mothers. And so all women are treated as if they're going to have children. And what that shows you is that women will never achieve equality until mothers achieve equality. And that's true of non-mothers as well as mothers. Not only women, but really all non-parents pay a price under the current system, because in the United States today, we really have very few languages to put a limit on work demands. And in many workplaces, the only acceptable one is to talk about your need for limits and your need for a life in terms of family. And that is one of the reasons why a lot of people just absolutely need to have a life, but it's not the only one. We as a society are really out of balance when it comes to the place of paid work in a full adult life, and we need to be mindful of the need to develop a language for people to say, I love my job, I love my career, I'm very committed, but there are limits. And that does not mean that I'm not a serious professional. Unfortunately, this is often not the case, and you often find these family-friendly policies that are designed, they're de facto designed so that only mothers can take them. That actually, I think, places people in a pretty bad situation legally. But they're often defined so that only parents can take them. And that's not the ideal in many contexts. In some contexts, that's what's going to happen. But what's very important to recognize is that if somebody goes part-time, if you allow somebody to go part-time, you as the employer are putting half, quarter of your salary, of her salary, back in your pocket. And you should use that money to pay for some replacement work. If you allow people to go part-time by speeding up colleagues, this is not going to help women. It's not going to help anyone. And if you allow people to go part-time and don't replace that work, you know what? She's not part-time. Her job isn't going to go away. So it's very important when you allow someone to go part-time to recognize that you need to pay to replace the work that is no longer getting done. So this is a system that is certainly bad for men. It's certainly bad for women, whether or not they have children. But in many ways, the people who really pay the worst price for the way we organize work today is children. If both parents work full-time in this overdrive economy, what you have is one commentator who called 2 adults with 3 jobs, 2 paid jobs, and then the job at home. And there was a recent study that actually asked the children of working families whether they minded if mom worked. That was, of course, the way it was framed. No question about whether they minded if dad worked. But what the kids said is that they actually felt with working moms that they did have enough time with their mothers. That makes sense, actually. Working moms spend over 82% the amount of time with their children that mothers at home full-time spend. But the children said that what they really missed was enough time with their fathers, interestingly enough. I suspect it would be the same if you interviewed children about it with stay-at-home mothers, what they missed. And in the dual-parent families, the children also said that they were distressed by the high levels of stress within the household. These levels of stress can be documented in various ways. The most dramatic documentation really is in terms of so-called tag teamers, where mom works one shift and dad works the other shift. Actually, 1 out of 3 families with small children in the United States handle child care through tag teaming. Those families have 3 to 6 times the level of divorce of the national divorce rate. That's a very dramatic evidence of the kind of stress that families are under because of this overdrive economy. Children in those are children in dual career households. Children in both single parent and dual parent households pay an even greater price economically in other contexts. Because what you really have when you think about that way of defining the ideal worker is what it creates is a system that provides for children's care by pushing the caregivers to the margins of economic life. And that makes it tough on women who are committed to their careers, but more to the point, they do not suffer economically, those women, so long as they remain married to an ideal worker. But we have a 50% divorce rate. And if those women get divorced, you see the situation where women have at first marginalized and then divorced. And what you have is very high rates of maternal and child poverty. Over 40% of divorced mothers end up poor, typically taking their children with them. And when you combine that, divorce is a key engine of economic inequality in the United States. And so is single motherhood. You think of the paradigm poor person in the United States, you know who you think of? A mother and her children. And those are the groups that are poor. Well, if you design a system that provides for children's care by systematically impoverishing their caregivers, not too surprising, the children are the poorest group in the United States. And the economic impact on mothers has been also extensively documented in terms of what economists call the family gap. The wage gap between young men and women has actually really narrowed very substantially. Young women now earn about 90% of men's wages, which, as I always say, is great if you want to die unmarried and childless at 30. If you don't, however, the gap between the wages of mothers and others has actually widened in recent decades, and it's worst for single mothers. And so that mothers actually earn only about 60% of the wages of fathers. And for those of us who started out when we all wore 59-cent buttons representing that women earn 59 cents for every dollar men earn. Well, now it's mothers earn 60 cents for every dollar that men earn. And that, again, shows you how this system of organizing market work and family work is such a powerful engine of inequality and childhood poverty. So that's the problem. Now I've depressed everybody, I'm sure. What are the solutions? The solutions are complex. Obviously, I don't have a silver bullet. I can't talk about them all today. Basically, we need to go back and redesign that ideal worker. The ideal worker was a very conscious cultural product. It was invented around between 1780 and 1820 as part of a gender system that was consciously designing careers for men supported by housewives. The structure of the professional career and the blue collar career, basically all good jobs, remains designed according to that template. The only problem is the demography has changed. And now you have men in those careers who are not supported by housewives, and you have women in those careers who sure as heck are not supported by housewives. A few are supported by house husbands. That's a different topic. There tends to be actually somewhat different family patterns even in those families, because the women, in many ways, the children do best under that pattern because the women will not give up a lot of the involvement. So those are the families that have the highest levels of parental involvement. So how do you redesign that ideal worker? Well, you know, in many ways the tools are already there. We're just in the process actually of inventing them for academic careers. But outside, you know, we already know them. Flex time, compressed work weeks, part-time, permanent part-time, optional rather than mandatory overtime, sabbaticals, parental leave. All of these things still exist. And in fact, most large employers in the United States, academic institutions aside, actually have flexible work arrangements on the books. Problem is that they have very low usage rates. And there are two real problems. There are two reasons why they just don't work right now, by and large. Some of them work beautifully, I should say, but a lot of them don't. And where they don't, it's because of really two factors that we've discovered in our studies. One is schedule creep. And that's what happens when, again, someone is allowed to go part-time in an ad hoc way with no provision for how the rest of the work is going to be done. What happens? She ends up doing the same job at half the salary. And then what's the next step? She quits. Mother's choice. It's a reflection of their own priorities. That's not, you know, what's going on is very rigid job structures driving women out of the workforce. So schedule creep is the first problem. The second problem really is stigma. There is very substantial stigma in many workplaces that's associated with use of flexible work arrangements. There's no reason this has to be. There are some major employers who have all but eliminated the stigma. Interestingly enough, it's the accounting firms that are really out in front on this. And the reason they are is they actually do the numbers, and they have become aware that churning women through a system where you bring them on in equal numbers and have very sharp attrition rates after they become mothers is really bad for the bottom line. It costs about 150% of a worker's annual salary to replace her when she leaves. And so places like Deloitte Touche have estimated that they've saved up to $20 million in a single year by sharply reducing attrition once they remove stigma and schedule creep from flexible work arrangements. Also, of course, as you won't be surprised, they have a very sharp increase in the number of women partners. So what do we need to do? We need to redesign the ideal worker. Why do we need to do it? Well, partly for business reasons. Designing an economy in a way that mismatches the workforce doesn't make sense from an economic standpoint, and it's producing huge costs. The other reason we really need to do this really takes us back again to that ideal worker. And this is another part of the work that we've done in the institute that I run. If you go back and think about that ideal worker, an ideal worker takes no time off for childbearing. Well, who needs no time off for childbearing? And an ideal worker takes no time off for child rearing. Well, American women still do 80% of it. So if you've designed an ideal worker around someone with the body of a man and men's traditional life patterns, the problem here is not that women need accommodation or special treatment. The problem is sex discrimination. If you design your ideal worker around men and women don't fit, that's not a problem with women. That's a problem with the workplace design. And this is an analysis that's been around for a long time. You see it working out actually most clearly in the context of men who try to step out of traditional gender roles. If you have a man who tries to take time off after the birth of a child, often he faces a very difficult time, what I've called the chilly climate for fathers. And employers need to really be attentive here because at some point the chilly climate becomes a hostile environment based on sex. If they're systematically routinely allowing women to take parental leave, and they're not allowing men to take parental leave, either formally or informally, that can eventually lead to some legal problems. And I'm thinking here of a case called Knussman versus Maryland. This was a Maryland state trooper, and his wife got ill as a result of her pregnancy. So he went in and asked for the leave that the women were granted, sort of as a matter of course, 30 days paid leave. His supervisor told him that he couldn't have the leave, quote, unless your wife is in a coma or dead. She also said that, you won't find me giving you leave until you can nurse a baby. Tactless. They also cost the state of Maryland over $665,000 because that was a clear violation of equal protection. And so you can, in some contexts, run into legal problems with a family hostile workplace. We've documented this in a report called the New Glass Ceiling Report that we issued about a year ago, and I can talk more about legal theories if you're interested. Since this isn't a legal audience, I won't go deeply into them. But since we issued this report, we've actually had management-side employment lawyers recommending to their clients that they institute part-time tracks, that they make sick leave policies available for care of dependents, and they institute all kinds of other family-friendly measures in response to this growing potential for liability. Because one of the things we found is that although people now know not to say, we don't hire women, that's something that we actually saw in the 70s. We don't see that anymore. People come pretty close to it when they're talking about mothers. And here's just some cites from some cases. In Morvey, Alabama, a woman's supervisor looked at her. This was actually an academic case. He looked straight at her belly. She was 8 months pregnant and said, I was going to make you head of the office. He said, but look at you now. Liability. Treza versus the Hartford Inc. The employer told the plaintiff he didn't believe that mothers should work, that they could not do either job well, and that women were not good planners, especially mothers. Liability. Walsh versus Centennial. This was actually the case that was picked up on CBS News when we issued our report. There, a woman's employer allegedly threw a phone book at her and told her to find a new pediatrician because her child got a series of ear infections. Again, a judgment of over $600,000. So this is a growing area of the law. It's what it shows is that the business case has been around for a long time, but in many ways it's not just an issue anymore of whether an employer wants to do the right thing, because part of the business case increasingly is beginning to be the potential for liability if you have somebody in your organization who might make these kind of statements, what I call loose lips. And that's sort of scary for employers because, which of us knows what every single person is doing in our workplace environment. On the other hand, from the point of view of the young men and women coming up, there is seismic change, I believe, beginning to happen. And you know what? I've talked for a long time. I think I'm not going to talk so much about the politics. I'll be happy to talk about that. There are basically the structure of work and family, very briefly, creates wars within individual women of what should I do, I can't decide. It creates wars among women, mommy wars, for example, stay-at-home moms fighting with working moms. it produces racial conflicts, because after all, if you have the idea that you're going to solve this problem through a pass-the-buck solution, whom do you hire? You typically hire women of color who are underpaid and don't have benefits. And it produces really serious class conflicts. And that's a lot of what we've seen in recent American politics. So I'd be happy to elaborate on those issues or on any of the more general issues.
Have you done any research on how this trend towards everyone working more and the conflict that brings, how that affects community involvement, volunteerism, and have there been any noticeable changes or, I guess, decreases in that?
I haven't, but Bob Putnam has, the Bowling Alone guy. What Bob Putnam found was that there have been, as you know, a decrease in certain kinds of community involvement. It's controversial whether that's an overall decrease in community involvement, and I'm not sure it is. But what he found is that the family with the person who was most likely to be involved in community activities was a mom working part-time. And that's because she's working part-time, and the other part of her time she's dedicating to building community for her children. And so there definitely has been, Anne Bookman of MIT is also now writing a book linking the decrease in community involvement to this sense of overload. So I think that's a very important point.
What would be your overall solution to problems that are always known to be women's problems, but they don't ever get any attention until they become men's problems as well? Such as the sex scandal in the Catholic Church. Nothing happened to it until certain men overcame homophobic things and brought issues to light when females had been molested and hurt for centuries and decades. The same here, only when workplace issues begin to affect men wanting time off do workers and employers start to address issues that have always hurt women. What's your solution to
I mean, this is a general issue. I mean, this is part of the nature of social hierarchy. In some ways, these issues are beginning to gain mainstream attention now because white women are in the situation that black women have been since they ceased to be slaves. Because black women have always had to be providers as well as caregivers. And that's the situation that white women find themselves in. And that's one of the reasons they've moved towards the center. The other reason, as you point out, is that work hours have gotten so out of hand in the United States that even men are very dissatisfied with the number of hours. I think it's important in this context. I mean, there's sort of two traditions within feminism. One I call the foot on neck tradition of really using the language of anger against men and saying they have our foot on, didn't Angela Grimke start here? This is actually from Angela Grimke, picked up by Kitty McKinnon. I actually don't work in the foot on neck tradition. I don't think it's helpful. I mean, I do think women, it's just part of the tradition of gender bonding through anger against the other sex. And both sexes do it. If you've ever gone into a locker room, both sexes do it. And there's a time and a place for it, but in this particular issue, I don't think it's helpful. And I do think that men, I try to address the yearnings of men in this context as much as I address the pain and the yearnings of women, because I really think we're on the same side in this issue. I really think men are deeply dissatisfied, and I actually don't think being a 60-hour-a-week ideal worker is any picnic. I don't think most people would choose it if they had a better choice.
I have two questions actually, and one follows on what you said, and one of the concerns I have whenever we concentrate on, the poverty rate and the disadvantage of divorced women, then we have solutions such as those offered by the current administration that get all the women married, and then you don't have those poverty problems, then you resolve them. So I wonder how we could deal with that so those facile solutions are not operating. And my second question is that in the academe, it's not necessarily the organizational structure that imposes the rigors of the job on us. We do it to ourselves because we're competing against persons where two people work for the same career. The dual career people have,
It's called the two-person career.
Right, exactly. And so what I'm wondering is how we could handle that in the academia and how we could, compensate for it somehow, because the standards are indeed set by the two-person career, and the rest of us, the dual career people, have to keep up with that, and it's very difficult.
So the first question was one question was the dual person career, and your first question was the just get married solution.
Right.
The just get married solution doesn't work, and it doesn't work really for two reasons. It's certainly not an effective anti-poverty program because of what's called assortative mating. People mate by class. And so if you're going to look at sort of underclass women and say, improve your economic situation by marrying the men you would naturally marry, they're not going to help their economic situation because those men are even in a worse situation economically than the woman. Part of this is race. I mean, one of the key elements of racial hierarchy in the United States has been that black men have had a very hard time getting good jobs ever since Reconstruction. And so, I mean, that's part of the racial hierarchy. It means that it just doesn't work. It just doesn't work. Well, I'll tell George next time when I go home. The other part for other class women, really in the United States, we are not going to say to people, you can't get divorced. It just ain't in the cards. And once people get divorced, I mean, what we eroticize in women tends to be youth. And so once people get divorced, huge numbers of those women realistically will not get remarried, and that's what the demography shows. So it's just not the just get married solutions just are not serious solutions. In terms of the two-person career, the classic academic career is a classic model of a two-person career. To the extent you need to work 60 hours a week and have a trailing spouse, you have two choices. Don't get married, which is what a huge proportion of the women do, or have a two-person career where both people are dedicating their energies to one career, which is what a breadwinner housewife family is really doing. It's very difficult at an individual level to say, I am going to compete with a breadwinner homemaker family in an institution that designs the ideal worker around a breadwinner homemaker family. My message is, that's not consistent anymore with institutional excellence. It's not consistent really for two reasons. There just aren't enough breadwinner homemaker families to go around. You cannot hire all ideal workers in breadwinner homemaker families if you are going to tap the available pool of talent. Because right off the bat, you eliminate defining your ideal worker even as 60 hours a week, quite apart from the trailing spouse. You eliminate three-fourths of the labor pool of women. And that's a lot of talent you just eliminated. And so it doesn't make sense in terms of excellence because you're not tapping the pool. And it doesn't make sense in terms of economics either, for all the reasons I'm talking about, because then you're in a situation where you're churning women through the system. And for example, in the hard sciences, when you hire a woman, you have to pay just as upfront costs between $2,000 and $500,000 to equip a lab, to set her up. When she leaves, that's a sunk cost that you just throw out the window. And you're going to throw it out not once, not twice, but repeatedly if you continue to define the ideal worker as a breadwinner homemaker family.
So in academia, it seems that the common solution for faculty is to give them extra year of tenure clock, which to me has always seemed strange because your research is the thing that you really can't let go. Your field passes you by and you're pretty much like, the one thing that you can give on is teaching. That, if you don't teach for a year, that, would seem to not hurt you in the long run. Have you ever seen institutions let women buy themselves out of teaching?
Yes, there's in fact, you don't even have to buy yourself out. There's a couple of models that are being very seriously discussed. in a lot of institutions. One is, the classic solution to this problem is stop the tenure clock. In my view, that's important. In my view, it's actually the least important step. Because exactly what young women tend to tell you is just what you said. I don't want to stop my research. I want to continue my research. And the policy that directly addresses that is called active service modified duties. And they have it in the UC system, they have it at University of Michigan. And that says that after your parental leave, which should be available to men and to women, you have another semester where you have active service duties and active research duties, but you do not have teaching duties. So active service modified duties is one option. The other approach is to have a part-time tenure track and either have people be able from the beginning of their careers to opt to to take either a full line or a half line and continue that throughout their careers, or to give them the option of knocking off to part-time for, say, up to 4 years. And that's another option where it's not a very attractive option in academics to have, for example, a part-time position that would be defined as teaching only, because that's slitting your own throat. You need to do part teaching and part research, but have something like a 35-hour week, which is what you could have if you had a true half-time tenure track.
One of the things that you said in coming up with solutions is take a look at the ideal worker and reconstruct who that worker is. And I've heard that critique before and understand completely where you're coming from and what you're saying about that. I think it's really hard though to get men to look at what is manhood in that very critical way and say, I don't want these ideas to represent who I am any longer. But I think the other complication there is that this is also tied into not just capitalism, but global capitalism. Transnational view of masculinity is this guy who works an awful lot, and women are trying to catch up with that ideal view. Under capitalism, can we create the kind of situations you talked about without looking at more, you didn't say it, but you were talking about socializing a lot of things. Can we avoid that conversation?
I'm actually very consciously not talking about socializing a lot of things. The solutions that people have developed in Europe do involve socializing a lot of things. Childcare, for one, through neighborhood systems of government-subsidized childcare centers. And very extensive in Sweden. You have an entitlement to work part-time until your youngest child is 6. I'm not talking about any of that. And the reason I'm not talking about that is I don't think it's going to happen in our generation. I mean, I have the misfortune to live in Washington, D.C., and we're talking about what to cut, not what to add. So I'm not talking about the socializing mother's burden solution, which has worked pretty well in Europe for avoiding childhood poverty. It has not worked at all well in Europe for solving the problem of women's equality. The economy in Sweden is actually more sex segregated than it is in the United States. To increase women's equality, you really need to deconstruct this system of providing for children's care by marginalizing their caregivers. There's one other part of your question I was going to answer.
Masculinity.
Oh, masculinity. This is actually all about masculinity. Women have changed. Women have changed a lot. And women have actually an incredible range. Just look around us. Look around to the women in this room. We can dress in pink in skirts. We can, dress sending the authority messages of a traditional man. Why did I choose this suit? Women do have an incredible number of choices in this society. Men have very few. Masculinity remains a very tight wetsuit at this point. And, most women are, a lot of men are really getting kind of sick of it. It's hot in there, and it's a close space. And I think that men are beginning to change. I mean, when I do radio talk shows, I'm always amazed. There is always the guy who is at home calling in and saying, both my wife and I work part-time, or I'm the stay-at-home dad. I do think we're beginning to see seismic shifts in masculinity. It takes courage. It takes courage because traditionally we've defined manhood very tightly with being a provider and being a go-getter in a context where when we talk about go-getter, we make no distinction between someone who is smart and someone who works a lot. That's just a category mistake there. So it does take courage for men to do this, but increasing numbers are. I talk to them all the time. And I think the levels of dissatisfaction with masculinity as traditionally defined are reaching important numbers, and they're showing up demographically in systematic generational differences between baby boomer men and Gen X and Gen Y men. The literature says that Gen X and Gen Y men, first of all, they have a different deal with their partners, so that they can't go off and be breadwinners and not change the deal. And so many of them feel ethically committed to equality in a way that the older generation, they just sort of felt, well, I guess the deal's going to change then, because that's what it takes to be a real family and a real man. The second thing is that the younger men actually saw their fathers take that old-fashioned deal and then be fired after 30 years. And you know what? They don't want that. They're just not interested. And that also is a huge source for change within sort of conventional masculinity. Yeah. Well, let's hear from someone first who hasn't spoken.
Oh, okay. You go ahead. Okay. I guess mine is a little bit like Sharon's question. It's been kind of playing in my head ever since I walked in the room. I'm involved in a lot of women's organizations at Iowa State, and oftentimes a group of women are gathered together and say, here's the problem, you women solve it. And when we get together, part of it is that we can't solve the problem unless the men in administration, leadership are listening. And I guess that's a little bit of my disappointment as I look around the audience today. And I know you've talked to other groups, so I guess my specific question, I'm disappointed not to see more men here, especially men in leadership positions, because to me, that's who needs to hear this message. But I know you've also talked to some other groups while you're here.
I've talked to groups of very different gender compositions.
Okay, so you have talked to them.
Yes, I have talked to the men and the women in power.
Is there any evidence for individuals who have a better balance between the family and their work, with fewer hours, for example, that the quality of the work is better?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?